welcome to Get Even, the podcast for ambitious women looking to go further. I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, and your host for this episode today. Get Even is a podcast where we interview successful women about their career stories, but we actually take a peek behind the curtain. So we learn about what it really takes to thrive. We learn about some of the hard choices that they've had to make in their careers. We learn about the messy realities behind the highlights reel. And if you're a woman who's got a lot on her plate, who wants to go far and who wants community and support, then this is the place for you. Welcome to Get Even. Hello and welcome back to the Get Even podcast. I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even and host of today's episode. Today's conversation is with Sarah Purches, who brings a refreshingly calm, human and commercially sharp lens to recruitment. This is a great conversation if you're curious about how hiring decisions are really made, if you want to learn about common mistakes people make in job applications and in the interview process, and if you want to learn how to stand out without performing or over-polishing and staying authentic. Sarah will also chat us through why your network and relationships matter far more than most people realize in a job search. Finally, Sarah will share some practical advice. She'll provide some grounded perspective on how to navigate a really competitive and pressurized job market for candidates. She'll share how to communicate well through the recruitment process, how to stay engaged in a respectful way, and also how to give yourself grace when your career feels quite uncertain. Sarah herself has had a really interesting career path. She is a former band manager who toured with some epic musicians. She's a co-founder of a gin brand. She's a solo mom by choice. And now she's the founder of Kindtide, a recruitment and talent advisory practice built on doing people decisions properly. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, good to see you.
I can't wait to share more about your story today. So we're going to learn a lot about the inside view of recruitment and selection from Sarah. And we're going to get some great career advice, some tips for how to handle yourself through the process if you're currently in that stage where you're looking for your next role. So Sarah, I want to get right into it, and I'd love to think back to your younger self who started her career in marketing. You were an executive assistant, and then you moved into talent and recruitment, which really has been your space for over a decade now. And I'd love to hear, what advice would you give your younger self about having a thriving career?
It's a really great question. I think there's just so much pressure to have everything figured out early, the career, the house, the relationship, the kids, and that's when you're 16, right? And most of it is just complete noise and rubbish. You don't have to have it all worked out straight away. And some of the best careers are built by exploring and staying open and saying yes to opportunities. And that doesn't mean that you've got a job hop every 12 months. Often it's more about leaning into internal opportunities to learn and grow. And it doesn't always have to be a promotion either. You never know when you're going to land in that thing that genuinely just lights a fire in your belly. So I would say careers are rarely linear. And as humans, curiosity really matters. So, keep learning, keep stretching your thinking, and keep exercising your brain. And growth just doesn't stop once you land a certain title. I think another thing that was really important that I would probably say to myself is, really focus on building those strong relationships with people around you and work closely with great leaders, absorb as much as you can, ask lots of questions, pay attention to things like how decisions are made. Some of my biggest learnings, they didn't come from classrooms or doing courses. They actually came from sitting beside leaders and just listening, observing, asking curious questions, and sometimes simply saying, can I help? The more real world exposure you get, the faster you'll build your judgment and your confidence and perspective. And I think that's the experience that actually compounds over time.
Amazing. Actually, can I come back to the one of the pieces of advice that you gave there, which was to build your network? And you didn't just sort of talk about that in the sense of having multiple connections or knowing lots of people.
Mm.
I think what's interesting is you also talked about internal network and getting to know leaders, witnessing what they're doing, observing, sharing, helping. Just can you expand on like why is it important to really build that network around you?
I think your internal network where you work currently is probably one of the most valuable networks you've got. You know, you are sitting, I guess, in an ecosystem filled with so much expertise, so much knowledge. So it's a great opportunity to actually lean in. To give you an example, when I was earlier in my career, I started out as a receptionist, a very fresh faced receptionist, and I was quite isolated outside sitting on a desk. And eventually I got the opportunity to come out the back and just help one of the other PAs. And it was in there that I actually got to see, what was a recruitment process? What are the questions that they're asking? Doing phone screening, listening to the questions that they're asking and how they're responding, the way they would speak to their clients as well, and how they would consult to clients. And it just gives you so much more insight. It's almost like you're sitting in a classroom then and there.
Mm,
But, having the opportunities to look at projects that are happening within your organization as well and put your hand up and ask to be involved, leaders will see and notice those that are the ones that always are putting their hand up and wanting to get involved and, those who are really engaged. And I often would find it was those people that the opportunities came to them because they built that credibility. They showed that desire and hunger to grow, to learn, to develop. And they were not just sitting back demanding a promotion, they were actually leaning in with curiosity and demonstrating that eagerness to actually develop. And I think that speaks a lot more than sitting back and saying, well, I just did this course and I want a promotion. There's a lot more steps to it. And, even later on in life, when you do build those really strong relationships internally, no matter what stage you are in your career, I know even today, working in Kindtide, I'm going back to those relationships. And it's the relationships that I built with amazing leaders across my career who are my biggest cheerleaders in this business. So it's not just about leveraging those relationships whilst you're only working there. Genuinely lean in and build credible, relationships. And it goes both ways. You support each other. It's a lifelong relationship.
I 100% agree. I think it's often we don't realize, especially in early career, just how much those relationships stay with us over the course of a
Yeah.
career. And you often think about just, how do you get things done when you're early on? But actually, I think it's quite interesting those people that you build that trust with, that get to know you, that you demonstrate your competence with. I think they can often become lifelong career advocates. And like you said, it can go both ways, which ideally then you're in that position where you can add value, you can help others, they can help you. But I think it's often I can see with our community, I can see that sometimes that's one of the most neglected aspects of navigating and taking charge of your own career is actually just taking charge of your relationships
Yeah.
and making sure that they're thriving.
Absolutely. And I mean, the amount of times in my career where I've spoken to people about, how did you land the career or the job that you've got today? Like it's been so interesting. And 5 out of 10 times, I would probably say, people are saying, oh, well, my previous manager or my previous CEO that I worked with actually reached out. Like, how wonderful.
Absolutely. So I want to come to career advice next. And I'm sure you've dispensed a bit. You've probably also heard a lot of career advice, but I'd love to hear your best and worst career advice that you've ever received, Sarah.
Oh, goodness, goodness. Okay, so I would say I'll start with the best. The best advice that was given to me, and I can't even recall who it was from, and I've probably heard similar things throughout my career actually from great leaders, but it would be to stay curious, to try new things, and to say yes to helping on projects and build those skills that compound over time, like communication and relationship building and commercial thinking. And probably the most important one is self-awareness. Do periods where you actually do some deep reflection on what was your reaction and how do you, when you're stressed out, like how does that actually impact you and the way you interact with others? Do you let it interfere with you or is it something you can kind of manage? Titles will come and go, and these are the skills that will follow you your entire career and they will open doors that you didn't know even existed. So I think it's really important to invest in those and, as I was saying before, observe other leaders who do this really well in your current organization and really learn from that. The worst advice would probably be, and it's so terrible because it actually came from my dad, so thank goodness he's not here today, and he probably will not be listening to this podcast. But it was to keep your head down and your bum up and get on with it. And it's just a very old school mentality. And I remember at the time I was working in a really small business and I was the only female in the business. And all the men, it was a real boys' club, they would all go to the pub from 12 o'clock most days. And most days they'd come back pretty rowdy and rude, probably 3 or 4 pints in. And I was only 18 or 19 at the time. So, I was pretty naive, but I remember nervously laughing it off. There's that real old school mentality about sucking it up. And I really disagree with that. And times have obviously changed. But if you are in an environment where you don't feel valued or safe, get the hell out.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Just don't even think about it.
No,
And it's not you.
no, it's not you. And there are so many wonderful workplaces out there. I've worked in many of them. I'm so lucky. But I hear about similar stories today of people in workplaces exposed to that. Yeah. To me, it's like, why would you stay in a toxic relationship? Get
Yeah.
out.
You've got so much more choice than you realize. And
Yeah,
it's
you do.
so actually then for you, how did you know, you've built your own business with Kindtide. You've been in recruitment internally as well. How did you know that that was the thing or the career that you wanted to be in?
I didn't know straight away. In fact, I actually wanted to be a lawyer or a dentist. I just tried a lot of different things and I kept noticing what I kept coming back to. And it really was surrounded by helping people, creating opportunities and work that genuinely changed lives. I didn't want to, I worked at Witness Shoes earlier in my, teen career selling shoes. And whilst that's wonderful and shoes do bring joy, it certainly wasn't going to be a long-term career for me. And to date, I've had a pretty colorful career. So, marketing, I've worked in TV, I've done band management, I've toured with some pretty big names. I've started a gin company that went on to win awards alongside being a receptionist and an EA and then moving into talent and recruitment. And I've enjoyed majority of it. The roles that didn't feel right, I stepped away from pretty quickly, but also thoughtfully. And I used them as learning moments. But over time, I guess a pattern emerged and I was consistently drawn to roles where I was impacting people and shaping organizations. I really enjoyed getting involved with leadership at that strategy level and really understanding the work that I do. How does that impact an organization? That excites me, especially when you actually see the tangible results. And I also started to reflect on what are the things that I'm good at, what am I actually passionate about, and where do those actually intersect? What's the sweet spot?
Mm.
And I figure, when you love what you do, that's when you know. So as long as you're still being challenged and you're learning, you're probably in the right place. But I think it's also to be mindful that when you're not loving what you're doing, sometimes it is actually the environment and not the role or what you're doing itself. So just be mindful. A great manager and a great team makes a really big difference, and a bad one can be quite draining.
So being able to separate the environment from the actual core of what the role is about.
Yeah, what's the quote they say before you diagnose yourself with depression, just make sure you're not being surrounded by jerks. So, and I think, that can be kind of relevant to that situation too. And I've been in that situation. I did have moments in time where I was just like, maybe I'm just done with TA and recruitment. Maybe I'm just fed up with this. And it really just came up to I'd either outgrown the environment or I wasn't really feeling fulfilled or happy with the manager that I was working with that was making it quite challenging. And it was just time to move on to something different or explore different industries. So, the role in itself I actually really loved.
Okay. And so I want to get more into that inside view and that expertise that you hold in talent and recruitment. And before we started recording, Sarah and I were chatting about 2025 and the start of 2026 being quite tough for a lot of candidates that we know. So the perspective that you've got to offer on this, what are some of the common mistakes that you see in applications that can stop candidates from getting to interview?
Yeah, I'm actually working with a lot of people at the moment on this because, as you pointed out, 2025 is a really, really rough job market. There were a lot of people who haven't had to apply for a job in 15 years, and now they're finding themselves unemployed and not even getting callbacks. So I guess some of the advice I've given to these people, I'll start with the first one, is it really experienced candidates are cramming their resumes onto a 2-page CV. And that rule largely comes from the US. In Australia, and particularly for senior roles, like a 3 to 4-page CV is completely acceptable if it's relevant. You've got a lot of experience and we want to know about what that is and the impacts that you made. Like if you're, 7-year role as, a head of product, it takes up a quarter of your resume. Like how much of an impact did you really make? I'm sure you made a lot more. So I feel don't remove really important stuff just to fit it onto a 2-page CV. The most important stuff is the impactful detail. So don't skim over that. The other thing is a lot of CVs list responsibilities, but don't
Mhm.
necessarily say anything about outcomes or achievements. So it's really helpful to actually understand the scope of the role. That's obviously important. But if I can't see the value that you brought or what changed because you were there, it's really hard to feel compelled to keep reading. It's a competitive market. So what makes you wonderful? I want to see the impact that you make. And, if there's 5 or 6, bullet points listed about your general responsibilities that are listed on your PD, sometimes that can be reflected as someone that just wants to come and do their 9 to 5 and go home, which is
Mm.
fine in some roles, but depending on where you're at in your career, you want to stand out from the others. You want to get that interview. So we need to make sure that we are selling ourselves appropriately on our resumes. And
So would
another
you
big
say
one,
list it as numerical impact?
I think, well, yeah, I think, what is the value that you bring? What are the problems that you solved? If there's numbers or metrics, money that you saved or growth for the organization, percentage of growth, like anything where you can bring stats or data into that conversation, how it was measured is really valuable and really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so let's say you've taken on board that advice and you've really reshaped your resume. You've made it about impact. And especially at a more senior level, you've actually given yourself a bit more space to expand on your roles.
Mm.
Next step then, so once you've actually landed the interview, what are some of the tips that you've got for how do you hold yourself through that process? How do you engage with recruiters and hiring managers? What are some of the things that you see candidates doing well, but also where do you see them trip up?
Yeah. So I usually like to with my hiring managers or even myself, I like to work with a reasonably comprehensive scorecard. So it helps us stay on track, but it helps us almost score the interview in an unbiased way. So probably the first thing that we look for is impact. So I want to see the evidence of the outcomes, not just the capability. So we think about the STAR method. What was the situation? What was the task? What did you actually do? And what was the outcome? What changed because you were there, and be quite confident talking about your achievements, the metrics that we touched on before, and what were the actual results. So it doesn't hurt to have notes in front of you if it's a Zoom interview, or even bringing notes in with you to prompt certain things. I think that's fine because, depending on the interviewer, interviews are so nerve-wracking and we're dealing with people. It's not a performance. You're not being judged on who sung the best and who did the best dance, unless that's the job you're going for. So I think we need to lean in and allow people to just be real in those situations and not discount them because they're nervous.
Mm.
I think authenticity also matters, but the credibility has to come from being able to back it up. So if you're asked about your impact, just be mindful about what you're saying when the question, is about what you actually did and what you did. So when I mean what you did, a lot of people will respond and say, oh, well, we did this and we did that. But it's like, but
Mhm.
I'm asking about what your impact was, not what your team did.
You use
Um,
I language, my.
so what I did is this was my approach and these are the steps I took and this is who I spoke to or stakeholders I engaged with and this is what the next step was and this is what the outcome was. I think that can sometimes really throw an interview, and particularly at a more senior level or even in individual contributor levels. Like if you're solely responsible for that function, but you keep saying we, and you're stepping or interviewing for a role where you are the only person looking after that step and you don't really have a team to lean on, we want to make sure that you can actually self-manage these things. And probably the other thing would be, as I touched on before, we're not looking for a performance, but they're looking for someone who's genuine and grounded and reliable. So, can we trust you to show up? Can we trust you to actually take accountability? Or do you blame everyone else in the process? We want to see you can actually handle pressure with maturity and raise issues or problems in a tactful way. And then probably the third one, I think this is probably the big one where a lot of people trip up, is your actual intent. So why this role? Why this organization? Why now? If you can clearly connect your strengths to the actual business problem, that will stand out. But, organizations are quite purposeful in that if they're hiring someone, they want to hire someone that genuinely wants to work for their company. You've done your research on the company before you've gone for the interview. You may have read some articles about what's happening with them in the media recently and just having some really smart questions that are relevant to the interview. I think when people come in and get asked, so tell us a little bit about what our company does. And let's say it's Origin Energy. And you're like, yeah, you're an energy company. Cool. Where do you go with there? You just kind of going to be like every other person. We want to know
Yeah.
why. Yeah, you
Yeah.
need to show that why, the intent, and that really does help you step out. And when you've fumbled through that, it's not a great look.
No, definitely not. I can echo that. What about some thoughtful questions to ask? So I love that advice of you definitely should be asking some questions based on the research that you've done about the company. What are some of the great questions that you've heard?
Yeah, I think it depends on what stage of the interview that you're at. Sometimes first interview, certain questions are probably not appropriate. But I think some of it from that first round interview, some of the great things I like to ask or that I have been asked is, someone had said to me a while ago, you've been with the organization for 7 years. What keeps you here? What do you
Mm,
like about the organization? Another one has been, what are perhaps some of the systems or processes in the organization that currently frustrate you that could be improved? I thought that was a really good one because there are a lot of things to being a scale up. We didn't have everything figured out. And what was another one that we got asked? What does good leadership look like in this organization?
wow, that's a good one.
Yeah, I thought that was really great. And then they actually went on because we were recruiting with the hiring manager. They actually asked the hiring manager a bit more about what was their leadership style and how do they actually go about growing people in their team.
Okay, so quite specific, actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got to remember, and I think this is a really important one for candidates, like candidates are interviewing the hiring manager just as much as the company is interviewing them. So think about what's really important to you in a role. And it depends on where you're at any time in your career. If you're pretty early at that early stage, I think, take the opportunities. You don't want to be trying to step into your first role and negotiating things like, well, I only want to do 10 to 3 because I like to go for a swim on this day and this day. Like you're going to have to be a little bit more flexible because there are going to be people that will jump in and they will, be doing the regular hours and they'll be happy to actually be in the office. You're going to be competing with people like that. So be, a little bit realistic too.
Yeah, be mindful, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and so let's assume you've done well at the interview, you've got a good sense of the company, and then many candidates actually report feeling ghosted or not receiving much feedback. From your experience, what's good candidate etiquette to communicate during that process? So how can you stay engaged but do so in a respectful and considerate way?
This is something that really frustrates me, and I've done so much work on it to the point where I was a finalist for Excellence in Candidate Experience at the Internal Talent Awards last year. There's no excuse for it. There just isn't. I think in this day and age where automation and technology is everywhere, ghosting has absolutely no place, and it's sloppy and it's disrespectful, and it almost reflects an organization's values. And I understand that hiring can get messy. We're human, feedback can take time, decision makers and stakeholders can be really hard to pin down. And sometimes they actually want to run a process for a week and interview everybody and then collect their thoughts after that process. Sometimes processes just don't move as quickly as what we would like. And it can take a week to get feedback. And that can be quite realistic, but no feedback at all is just not acceptable. Or, feedback like, oh, we've decided to go in another direction, or we just feel you're really overqualified for this. It's a cop out. And the only way candidates are able to put their best foot forward for the next role is with honest, tangible feedback. So one of the worst practices I still see is organizations that state on their job ads that they will only, respond to successful candidates. And that's very outdated. That's so 40 years ago. It's lazy and it's disrespectful. Platforms like Seek make it so easy to communicate, and even LinkedIn makes it really easy to communicate with all applicants in a way that's still human and considered. And it doesn't need to be a bland and generic response.
Mm,
I get it. We sometimes receive hundreds of applications and it is impossible to call every single person. But once someone's actually invested the time in an interviewing process, like they've actually attended an interview, the standard should be so much higher. So at a bare minimum, I would expect that they deserve a follow-up email with meaningful context. But best practice for me is a phone call with detailed feedback. So ideally a conversation that goes for at least 15 minutes because they're going to have some questions as well. But I think it's also important to get their feedback on the interview too. It goes both ways. From a candidate perspective, I think if you're following up respectfully, usually a week later is
a
appropriate.
week?
Yeah, I'd say a week. If you're still hearing radio silence, it's probably worth asking yourself whether or not it's actually an organization that you do want to work for. How candidates are treated in a hiring process really does say a lot about the company's values, and ghosting, particularly after an interview, is a pretty big red flag. So hiring should be human. We're dealing with people after all. So clear communication, respect, and honesty, it matters just as much as what the final decision does. And I think one thing that organizations sometimes forget is an interview process is part of showcasing your brand, and people. So if someone goes through 3 rounds of interviews and hears nothing from you, they're going to tell that to their partner, their family, their friends. And I know for telling people like my parents, they're in their 70s. So they're going to talk about that for the next 3 weeks with all of their friends, whether it's at the golf club or, their local coffee shop. Like that is going to spread. And then those people are going to tell their children and their children's children. So, there is a snowball effect. And yeah, I do believe that you should treat candidates really well throughout the process and think of them as a potential customer, think of them as a potential brand advocate. And it's the little things that matter and go a really long way. It doesn't take a long time to deliver honest and tangible and kind feedback.
That's such an amazing perspective from the recruiter's side of it or from the company side of it. And I actually think that's it's such great advice to really think about this as a test. If you're on the interviewee side, this is a really good test as well as to what kind of company do you want to work for and work with. But let's imagine if you are you are looking for a role right now. And one of the things I've been hearing a lot in 2025 and early 2026 is people really, sending out hundreds of resumes, perhaps going through quite a number of processes and getting quite discouraged. So I'm wondering from your perspective, do you have any words of wisdom to offer to people who are feeling that right now, who are feeling that sense of, they're going through that rejection, they're going through like, what can I do? What's going on? Help me make sense of this.
Yeah, listen, it is a really competitive market. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind here, and I think it's sometimes you've got to step back and go, what's in your toolkit? And it probably comes down to your personal branding as well. It can get a bit overcomplicated. There's a lot of noise out there about what your CV should say and what your LinkedIn should say. I think your professional brand already exists. And the question is whether you're shaping that intentionally or you're leaving it to chance. So a lot of organizations also aren't advertising roles at all. So we need to be mindful of that. It's not just about applying for roles. There is a hidden job market and they're doing direct search. So that means that if you're not findable on LinkedIn, for example, how are those opportunities coming to you? So think of your toolkit as, yes, you've got a resume there, but your LinkedIn profile also can serve as a lot of leverage. So that means making sure it's complete and current and compelling. So if it's bland or lacks content, recruiters or, headhunters are often going to move straight onto the next profile.
So
You
what
know,
should you be adding as a basic minimum?
yeah.
What should be in your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, well, it's not just a job history, right? They're marketing tools. So if they read like a list of duties, you're underselling yourself. They need to show ownership, outcomes, influence. They've got to tell a bit of a story and one that actually makes people curious enough to want to speak to you. So I think if you think of it this way, that you're the product and the impact is your value proposition. And this is where the clarity beats the noise. So making sure that you actually have a title that reflects you. And let's just say you're a business analyst. Don't just put business analyst. You might be someone that's business analyst in scale up SaaS organizations with Salesforce experience, like add that in there. There's algorithms that will pick up on a lot of these keywords in there. Do a bit of an about section about you and don't be afraid to use your tone of voice and reflect who you are. If you are someone that perhaps really thrives in a more innovative organization that's fast moving and a bit more fun, maybe it's in the startup space, let that reflect. But if you're someone that prefers more of a very structured organization, that's a bit more established, let that reflect too. And under each job, don't just put that you work for Ozpost as a business analyst. Like, what team did you sit in? What were some of the projects or challenges that you worked on? And what were some of the achievements that you had during that time? So the achievements are really, that's your selling point there. So making sure that's in there. And just, a nice headshot. You don't need to go and spend money on a photographer. A great selfie can do wonders sometimes. And, if you really need to brush it up, a little bit of AI can help in that space, providing it still looks like you. And just, a nice cover photo that's, it just completes it. It gives you that completeness and making sure that it lines up with your resume as well. You want to make sure the dates line up. You don't want it to create doubt in a recruiter's mind where they look at your LinkedIn and then they get your CV and it's not adding up.
Amazing. Wow. That's actually a lot more interesting detail about LinkedIn than I'd ever considered. But it's really interesting to think about what is a recruiter going to look for. So things like you said, the inconsistencies, things like do you actually have specific projects, achievements listed? I actually love that level of detail. It's something that I hadn't considered. Is there anything else from a personal branding angle that you think can help candidates to stand out?
Yeah, I think, and speaking to a few more senior leaders recently, there's a lot in there that really helps draw attention to your profile, and it's sharing content, writing articles. Like if you are an expert in, I don't know, let's say SEO search, like you could write a brilliant article and debunk some of the myths that are out there, and that will draw attention to you. Think about amazing projects that you've led and what you learned from those experiences. There are some really great things that you can share online, whether it's, writing a post a couple of times a week or doing a monthly article, creating conversations, but also engaging with organizations that you want to work for, following leaders that you would love to work for as well. If you can actually get yourself in front of these people, LinkedIn is a really great way of doing that. And, respectfully engaging as well. But, I wouldn't encourage people to be sending multiple emails to recruiters and just flooding their inbox. And probably the worst thing you could ever do is like, hey, how you going? We don't know each other. And that comes across as almost spammy. And there's a lot of fake profiles out there at the moment, and that's exactly how they engage. So if you are going to reach out to somebody that you don't know because you would like to work with them or you're looking for opportunities, be really careful about how you craft that email or that message. You don't want to waste that person's time or come across as you've just got no idea how to communicate. That's your 1 minute or 30-second elevator pitch. So, I'm reaching out to you because I've been following Canva for a really long time. The product excites me and I use it every day. And I've noticed that you're hiring for this role recently. Completely appreciate you're busy, but there are a few questions that I have that were not listed in the job ad. Don't ask questions that are readily available in the job ad. Don't ask questions that are readily available on the website. That just shows that you're not prepared. So be really mindful about how you're engaging the questions that you're asking. I think that's something that's really critical. I used to get really frustrated where people would actually reach out with questions that are very clearly detailed in the job ad.
Yeah. I love that. So it's really about being thoughtful. It's about engaging in a respectful way. And I love the example that you gave of how you can craft a message that shows that you've done your research, you've thought about this, you have a valid reason for reaching out. I think that's such great advice. Mm, I do want to hear more about what then led you to founding your new business, Kindtide, and what you saw as the opportunity and the problem space, because I think you've got quite a specific view of what recruitment should be as an experience.
Yeah, and it touches on some of the frustrations we just talked about today. Kindtide was essentially born from spending a long time inside of organizations and seeing recruitment from the other side of the fence as well. Recruitment, I believe, is really broken. And it's not broken in ways that are non-fixable. They're actually really simple ways of fixing it. In terms of like internal talent, I saw some pretty ugly agency practices that really put me off the traditional model. There's a lot of laziness, there's a lot of, flicking CVs with minimal or no real interview with the candidates, little to no feedback provided to the candidates, which is really deeply damaging, not just for candidates, but for the employer brand. So companies that I was representing. And when candidates have a really bad experience, that reflects directly on the organization as well as the agency. I also saw a growing issue with inexperienced people in the industry offering really poor advice. And if you don't truly understand an organization commercially and you don't deeply understand the role that you're recruiting for, it's impossible to genuinely consult or find the right person. You've got to have that credibility there. Recruitment isn't just matching job titles and matching keywords. It requires judgment and context and business literacy. And I also just wanted to create something different, a model where candidates are treated like your best customer. And in fact, they are treated at the same level of importance as a client is, with the same care, communication, and respect that you would provide. And on the client side, I felt that, organizations were just not getting the value that they deserve. Recruitment fees are really high, and the value shouldn't just come from the form of, a resume and a shortlist alone. I guess at Kindtide, we look at the whole talent experience, the whole ecosystem. So how a role is shaped, how it is advertised, the language that you use in that advertisement, and then through the interview process, how candidates are treated, what are the questions that are asked? How experienced are the interviewers that are participating in this? And are we asking the right questions to actually get the right information that we need to make an assessment of that candidate? Through to how the offer is made, how they're onboarded into the organization, and even beyond that. So,
Hmm.
if I see gaps or issues throughout that journey, it's my responsibility to actually call that out and offer to help fix them, because when those break down, it directly impacts whether or not that person who is hired into that role is successful. And I think that's, sometimes organizations don't have that lens, or they haven't thought about it. They're busy building business and doing all of these things. And particularly if they don't have an internal talent team or a HR team at times, there's no one thinking about that factor. So I think it's really important to share that knowledge. I guess at the heart of it all, it's a desire to put ethics and integrity back into
Yeah.
the driver's seat.
Is that the name behind it as well?
Kind of, yeah. Well, kindness, yeah, and tide. I live coastally, and I think there's something really beautiful and calming about the ocean, and the talent landscape and recruitment is absolute chaos. So I wanted to bring a bit of that calmness back into that process. I mean, at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, right? Humans. And I think kindness, transparency, and honesty, they matter so, so much. And when you combine that with like commercial rigor and deep understanding of organizations and jobs and people, you get way better outcomes, not just for your clients and businesses, but for candidates. So I guess, that's the gap that I'm trying to fill, human-centered, experience-led, and just commercially honest.
Of that. And I can see that there's such a need for it. And I can also see how your personal philosophy just shapes so much of it. Is there anything that, are there any final words of wisdom about talent or recruitment that you feel like we haven't covered that you think our community at Even would benefit from?
I think probably just one thing that's coming up with candidates at the moment, I think it's really important to give yourselves a little bit of grace, particularly if you've been out of work for a while and you are navigating this really, challenging job market. It's harder than it's ever been. And, I've seen that from an internal perspective. There were roles that we were hiring for that we would normally, and I mean, RMIT Online,
Yeah.
we had a wonderful employer brand. It was a great place to work. So we already had very engaged candidates wanting to work with us. So for any role, we would probably get, 1 to 200 candidates. There were roles, and that would be over, let's say it was advertised for 2 weeks. We were having days where it was like day 3 of the job being advertised, and we'd already hit that 200-300
Wow.
application with really good applications. I was having to work so closely with my hiring managers because we were not able to get to shortlists. They were long lists. And so I would walk through and they'd be like, wow, I can see why it's 20 people, because every single one of these people is amazing.
Mm,
It's tough. So just give yourself a little bit of grace. But also I think it's a really important time to look at your toolkit, reach out for help, do a little bit of research about, how to format a resume. And your formatting is really important as well. Like if your Word document is size 14 times Roman, stop, just, be really mindful about how you're presenting yourself on paper, because even just that can be really off-putting.
yeah.
But I think, be kind to yourself, network, reach out to all those great people you've worked with before, and, people genuinely want to help. But I think above all, give yourself grace.
Amazing. I love that. And I think it's just connect with people, ask for advice, ask for introductions. I think that's the nature of how this works. Amazing. Sarah, thank you so much. That was so valuable. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, where our mission is to accelerate women's economic potential. Check out even-careers.com to learn how we support women and business to get even.